CARM Logic, Law of Excluded Middle. From CARM.org, Law of Excluded Middle. A statement is either true or false without a middle ground. I am alive is either true or false. You are pregnant is either true or false. We will begin our critical analysis with a brief critique of the wording used in CARM's description of this law. We shall then offer an extensive critical display showing this definition to be pathetically weak and inaccurate. From CARM, a statement is either true or false without a middle ground. In logic, referring to a statement is logically equivalent to some statements. This is to say, logically, a statement is the same thing as saying at least one statement, but not all statements, or some statements are true or false. The classic formulation of the law of excluded middle is all statements are true or false, not a statement is true or false. Thus, when Matt Slick asserts law of excluded middle as a statement is either true or false without a middle ground, his wording is inaccurate expression of the classic laws of excluded middle. Clearly, when Matt Slick gives an example of the law of excluded middle, such as I am alive is either true or false, you are pregnant is either true or false, he assumes a bivalent or two-value logical system, which is true or false. However, bivalence logic is no longer adequate for logical expressions. Since the arrival of the first volume of Principia Mathematical by Russell and Whitehead in 1910, a new era of logical inquiry and development has occurred. In this time frame, many logical systems have been developed. And within those new logical systems, multivalent or multi-valued logical systems have been developed. We shall display only one, modal logic. Modal logic is a logical system that deals with necessity, possibility, contingency, compatibility, and other properties. What we shall now show is how modal operators effect the classic formulation of the law of excluded middle, which Matt Slick asserts is a universal law. We begin with the classic formulation of the law of excluded middle. All statements are true or false. And we shall now be more precise and use X to represent one statement included all statements. So we will say X is true or X is false. And now we add modal logic operators to this statement. X is true, or X is possibly true, or X is false, or X is possibly false. Thus we have already superseded bivalence logic, two values, true or false, by two more values, possibly true and possibly false. From here we can extend the range and scope of meanings of the modal logical operators to arrive at more evaluations. X is true, X is possibly true, X is possibly true, X is false, X is possibly false, X is possibly false. The question arises, is possibly X and possibly X equivalent expressions? The answer is that depends on the logical system. In some modal logical systems they are, in some they are not. What determines whether they are equivalent is the logical structure, called the metalogical structure. The metalogical structure determines the scope and range of meanings of possibly X. And as the metalogical structure varies, so does the scope and range of meanings vary. In some modal logical systems, we can string an infinite number of possibles to create an infinite number of evaluations. Thus, between X is true and X is false, we can literally have an infinite number of X's possibly possible ad infinitum. In modal logic, we can also add the following operators. It is necessarily true, or X is necessarily not necessarily true. X is necessarily false, or X is not necessarily false. X is contingently true, or X is contingently false. And we can mix modal operators. X is necessarily possibly true, or X is necessarily possibly false. Needless to say, even in this simple display, we can see that the classic formulation of all statements are true or false can no longer be said to be true. And when dealing with Matt Slick's law of excluded middle, a statement is either true or false without a middle ground. Even excusing Matt Slick's pathetic wording of this law, We have shown definitely there are indeed many valuations between true and false, and depending on the logical system, even an infinite number of valuations between true and false. Thus, this universal law of logic of excluded middle is not even universal within the realm of logical systems, even less outside of logic.